What's going on, y'all? KM here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. Starting with the Iron Patriot Victoria Hand deck. This list has been a killer at top infinite ranks, an absolute monster recently, and it's been the major way in which Iron Patriot and Victoria Hand have been played. Although there are so many different ways to play with these cards, this seems to be the one that is taking the most precedence. I gotta take a little bit of an L on this, because even though I was fairly early to playing this deck, I thought that when Iron Patriot and Victoria Hand came out, they would not be in hood-style decks, but they definitely have been. The best way to use Victoria Hand is with cheap cards, and in addition, by not overloading the Victoria Hand ability, we run into scenarios that are far less common in terms of blowing up our own ability to play more cards. So for example, in decks that are playing things like Snow Guard and Agent Coulson, in addition to the Kate Bishop stuff, they can end up bricking their own ability to draw cards just by playing cards. This deck does that a lot less, although hand management still is a major part of it. The nut draw with this deck involves copying Victoria Hand multiple times, which is a dominant strategy when you're able to generate as many cheap cards as this deck is able to generate. When you're not doing that, you're doing things like multiple hoods, thanks to Misery. And of course, the other copy cards that you have can be applied to demons as well, so you're very likely able to output a vast amount of points. You also have the interactive abilities of Red Guardian and Luke Cage helping you out. This makes you pretty good against a lot of other decks that are more invested into the Affliction strategy than you are. Just being able to splash Anti-Venom and Luke Cage in an otherwise good deck is something you're going to see a lot of on this tier list, and a lot of that is because of how powerful the Affliction cards are and how nice it is to have a one-card answer to them that also synergizes with something else you're doing. This is a very powerful list, and I would expect to see it a lot. In what must be a first, the first two lists on this tier list both involve the card Frigga, which is just crazy to me, but it is reality. Move Bounce is still excellently strong. While there are decks that can compete with it in a very real way in terms of power output thanks to Iron Patriot, I still suspect that Move Bounce, when played well, has the highest point ceiling of the reasonably played decks in the game, and being the deck that is able to consistently output points at this level is a valuable thing indeed. A deck that can put points out on a level of this magnitude is always going to be favored when it has its good draws, which means that you are almost always in the driver's seat when you decide to snap. That means that this deck has very good snap equity. You know what you have, and your opponents don't know what you have. And that ability to have massive point output on the final turn of the game without throwing, and while you throw priority to enable the fact that your opponent cannot interact with you in the future, that is one of the major things that this deck has going for it. It takes a lot of work to build a deck that is significantly better into Move Bounce than anything else, and it almost always involves the cards Invisible Woman, Ghost, or Supergiant. You need to be able to obviate their ability to throw priority and make their big guys untouchable, and if you can't obviate that, you are in trouble. And that is the fundamental value proposition for Move Bounce. We're going to go bigger than you, and you're not going to be able to tech against it unless you are specifically prepared to do so. Move Bounce is always going to be around as long as it remains the deck that is the best able to dodge interaction and output power. To the surprise of absolutely nobody, the classic Luke Cage Anti-Venom Malekith mid-range deck is still extremely strong. This, of course, is the Ajax list, and it has been modified by Sizer to put in a Juggernaut and an Iron Patriot. Truly genius deck building of we put the new good card into the old good deck. Something really after my own heart here. This is, of course, a very straightforward deck to understand and a fairly straightforward deck to play. Anti-Venom and Malekith are both extremely strong cards. One makes a card free, the other just puts it on the board, and of course you are able to do a ton of powerful stuff thanks to the power of interactive cards like Red Guardian and Juggernaut. This means that you have a ton, and I mean a ton of powerful, viable endgame options, different ways in which you can play them, and you are almost always outputting points in meaningful ways. The downside here is there are a lot of decks that are just playing a Luke Cage Anti-Venom package and aren't as invested in this stuff. And what that means is that when you are a deck that is relying on Man-Thing, that is relying on Ajax, and that's where your points comes from, you are going to be at a disadvantage against decks in the same sort of Luke Cage space that aren't relying on those. For example, Ronin Luke Cage decks are going to have a bigger 5-drop than you. That's just how it's going to work. If you both have Luke Cage, their stuff's going to be bigger. And that kind of stuff is the only real weakness that I think a deck like this has. It otherwise has the ability to build itself into a form that will beat mostly anything. And that is a very powerful situation to be in. It only really has that and one notable weakness of other Luke Cage decks that aren't as invested in the Affliction strategy can be very, very dangerous against it. Taking everything we just said into account, it becomes a little bit easier to understand why so many people are playing decks that look like this now. This is sort of the anti-meta deck. If you look at the 3 things that we just looked at, you'll see a lot of stuff that this deck is very specifically good against. It's an anti-venom Luke Cage deck that is also going to be, by nature of being an anti-venom Luke Cage deck, good into the Ajax decks because it's not as invested in the Luke Cage part of it. That means that it can have good matchups there. It's a Killmonger Invisible Woman, Killmonger Shadow King deck, which means that it has good matchups into move bounce. And finally, of course, it is still a Killmonger deck, which is good, very, very good, into a deck that is outputting things like multiple demons and counting on the arrows from Kate Bishop to get buffs from Victoria Hand. There are multiple different ways of approaching this right now, but I actually think the best way to understand a deck like this is to look at it and say, oh, this is Serra control. Because that's really what this deck is trying to do. This deck is trying to be the anti-meta deck that is answering all of the things that the sort of more meta decks are doing. And in so being, it is also sort of pushing the metagame in certain directions, right? If you keep getting Killmonger Invisible Woman, you're going to stop playing the deck that loses to Killmonger Invisible Woman. So this deck won't be the anti-meta deck for long. There's going to be other things that need to be modified into it. But I think this is sort of an example of how, even though this metagame is very, very coherent and very, very strong and has a lot of strong stuff in it, you can still find success building anti-meta, being the Mobius deck in a world of Iron Patriots, being the Killmonger Invisible Woman deck in a world where people are playing a bunch of Kate Bishop stuff with Victoria Hand and demons and stuff like that, being the Invisible Woman Shadow King deck in a world where people are playing move bounce. All of that stuff is super relevant. And so you can build a deck like this that is looking to apply the correct solution to various problems that we have. And that's what this deck is really trying to do. Now, you'll notice that the previous deck is still running Iron Patriot. I think of that version as a sort of halfway point between the Iron Patriot list that we saw at the beginning of this video and this list, which is the list that Stefan has been playing, and it is a much more pure control Serra list, right? The other deck is saying, like, look, I'm going to cheat using Anti-Venom, I'm going to cheat using Iron Patriot, I'm going to do some unfair stuff myself, and then apply the tech cards to my opponent. This list is saying, I'm only using Anti-Venom Malekith as far as cheating goes. The rest of what I'm doing is just straightforward Serra tech stuff. And that is really what this deck is trying to do. There is a bunch of counterplay to basically everything we talked about already in this list. Quake deals with Iron Patriot nut draws because Iron Patriot's ability gets applied to the location and not to where Iron Patriot is. So you can just move that Iron Patriot location out of the way. They're never not playing on the Iron Patriot location. You can prevent them from actually activating it. You also have, of course, the Invisible Woman Killmonger, Invisible Woman Shadow King, all of that stuff that goes incredibly well for you. And, of course, Anti-Venom Malekith, Luke Cage, very, very hard to be bad when that is your power output. Ronin is excellent in this metagame. Hardly a requirement here, but the Ronin Maximus package is quite solid because you're able to dump stuff behind Invisible Woman that is generally scary and can lead to people Eliathing the Invisible Woman lane. And a lot of the time, if that stuff is like Ronin or whatever, it's just going to be really, really dead. But if that stuff is like Maximus or whatever, it's like, okay, you put a 9 power guy into a lane where I already had 6 power under the Invisible Woman. Like, you're not actually going to win the lane doing that. And I think that sort of mix-up is very valuable in an Invisible Woman deck. This is also a deck that allows you to be a Ronin gamer in a world where people are putting a lot of cards into their hand. Very valuable as well. And of course, this means that you are able to have meaningful point output as an Anti-Venom Malekith deck into Ajax decks that are doing the same thing, but are more reliant on you not having Luke Cage. There are plenty of various Iron Patriot decks that we could talk about. I think as far as Wiccan goes, it has increased the amount of Wiccan play that I've seen. I strongly suspect that Anti-Venom Malekith is still a stronger core to build around, but Wiccan does seem to be putting up some reasonable numbers, and when I've played it, it's felt pretty reasonable personally. Wiccan, as a rule, typically has enjoyed previously going high curve. This list looks to make it low curve effectively. What we're trying to do here is be low curve and randomly generate stuff, and I think a list like this is sort of the Luke Cage canary in the coal mine, where if you see decks like this that are just literally curving out playing Luke Cage, it gets to a point where you wonder, like, all right, have we hit peak Luke Cage? Is there just too much stuff that Luke Cage does? Because we're not playing anything that synergizes with this other than Valentina, and we're still doing it. And it's just like, okay, all right, we might have hit the point at which things are problematic where it comes to Luke Cage. One of the major consequences of the proliferation of Iron Patriot V-Hand decks is the rise of Gorr. There is so much Gorr running around right now, and I personally think I lose more cubes to Gorr than to basically anything else because I just forget that it's an option so much of the time. Gorr Mystique is so big against literally every Iron Patriot deck. If you are an Iron Patriot V-Hand deck, probably 10 of your cards have on-reveal abilities, and some of them make other cards that have on-reveal abilities, and so you very often end up with like, okay, here's my full board, 9 on-reveals, my opponent is also playing on-reveals, Gorr comes down, he's like 30. And you just lose, because these decks don't have the ability to go over the top of that. And I think when we're talking about Gorr, it's usually best to talk about it in the context of a couple of different contexts. So we're going to start with, of course, the Anti-Venom Malekith shell. That's the build of Gorr we're seeing here. I believe this one was cooked up by Revis. There's some really nutty high rolls in this one, where like if you get a Malekith to pull your Mystique, you are balling beyond belief. And I gotta tell you, I've probably lost more cubes to Gorr than any other card recently. He has been an absolute beast when he's able to actually come down, but it does require a decent amount of acceleration, right? A lot of the Gorrs I lost to were Valentina Gorr or, Iron Patriot Gorr, and those are much better, obviously, than Gorr you actually have to pay a full 6 for. Paying a full 6 for Gorr is fine, but you typically need to be playing something else alongside him, so getting to that Gorr Mystique, either off of Anti-Venom or Malekith, can be absolutely game-breaking, 8-cubing, totally dominating. Here's what an Iron Patriot Quicksilver list could look like, and again, we see the Gorr here because Gorr is just such a powerful card in the mirror, but this is, of course, another deck that has energy acceleration built into it, and you're starting to see, I think, a pattern at this point where these decks tend to look fairly similar to each other. They're just trying to outpoint each other, do some strong, powerful things, and have whatever interaction they can afford to have for these kinds of things, but that can be, it's up in the air. I think one of the things that I have really enjoyed about Wiccan builds recently is that they are allowing so much space to be re-explored. We previously sort of arrived on Quicksilver as the thing to do, but now there's sort of more diversity in Wiccan builds. We saw one already on this list that was running 3/1 drops instead. I think it's an interesting push and pull. Ultimately, Quicksilver allows you to have more high-impact cards in your deck, where going smaller means that you're more reliant on randomly generating those cards. I think the power of randomly generating those cards should not be underestimated, but you're definitely going to get a more consistent output when you're actually putting the big cards in your deck on your own. Downsides and upsides to that one. This is a commonly played list that I would expect to see a decent amount of. There's going to be some flex in this, obviously. It's still early in the season, still early in the metagame, but there is something here, I think. By the same token, there's probably something here as well. What this deck is doing is incorporating the Galacta package into the Quicksilver Wiccan list, and that means playing effectively Galacta and then a bunch of movers, which can make it so that you're always able to either have priority or throw priority depending on what you want to do. The point I'm trying to make here is the previous list was playing a Fenris package. You don't need to be playing a Fenris package. There's a bunch of different stuff you can do in terms of the Iron Patriot Wiccan build, and a bunch of different things are going to be viable in that context. A lot of them are going to be very strong. Iron Patriot Wiccan, like pairing Iron Patriot with other ways to cheat energy is not just a great way to have your Iron Patriot be relevant and double the effectiveness of it, it's also a great way to say, like, look, okay, I didn't get my thing, but because I'm cheating energy, it doesn't matter that I lost the Iron Patriot lane because they invested a Juggernaut in it or whatever. I still get to play a bunch of stuff thanks to Wiccan. And I think that is very powerful. I'm not 100% sold on the Galacta package here, but that's not the point of what I'm talking about here. The point of what I'm talking about here is you should not get married to any one specific build of Iron Patriot Wiccan. There's a bunch of them right now, and it's going to take a little bit of time to figure out which direction we want to go. Do we want to be a Quicksilver deck? Do we want to play normal 1-drops? What packages do we play if we're a Quicksilver deck? All of that stuff has to be figured out, and each of those, if you think about it like a branching path, each of those leads us to different places depending on the choices made. You might think this list is kind of a joke, but there has been some real power in it, in my opinion. This is a butt cook that a couple of other people are working on in my Discord right now. But of course is like top 5 playing this, and I think a lot of it is just it's very hard to deal with what this deck is able to do. Things like taking priority with like Hope Summers Jean Grey type stuff. That's really scary because if you are able to, let's say, play Jean Grey and then Hope Summers Rocket Raccoon the Jean Grey lane or fill up the Jean Grey lane at that same time, suddenly you're able to actually just play an uncontested Galactus and then dump a bunch of Guardians in that lane. There's stuff that this deck can do, like lines that involve like Iron Patriot into Jean Grey, into Hope Summers and Rocket Raccoon. That's a Galactus. You're getting Galactus there. That's really strong. Like there's just a lot of scary stuff going on right here. And on top of all of that, this deck has a ton of ways to win Iron Patriot lanes. It's not just a Galactus deck, it's an Iron Patriot deck that has a lot of Iron Patriot lane winners because it has all the Guardians in there. It's a genuinely clever list. Like, I do think there's a lot more going on here than there has been in a while. I know a couple of my other friends have been covering this on YouTube. I don't know exactly because I haven't watched their videos, but I do think that the person who cooked this deck up should get the credit, and that person was Butt. Scream decks ain't dead. Gamer cooked up a Scream list that I think has a lot of potential as long as you don't run into Luke Cage. This is a hybrid of the Scream list and the Ajax list. The weakness, of course, is that like other very invested Luke Cage decks, it can be problematic when your opponent does have that card, because a lot of your top-end power is reliant on that. The way you get around that is just Scream on 2 is still really damn strong, and we are kind of in a mid-rangey metagame, and being in a mid-range metagame and being able to play Scream on 2 into other mid-range decks is genuinely bonkers. Like, it is an unbelievably powerful thing to do. Scream on 2 is phenomenal. Hydra Bob is phenomenal. You're very good at contesting Iron Patriot lanes. You're very good at doing a lot of stuff, but a lot of your top-end power, US Agent, Ajax, Hazmat, is kind of locked into Luke Cage kind of beats me, and you do have to be aware of that. I like Arishem, but I kind of wonder if it's starting to lack the tools to compete with the juiced Iron Patriot decks. Like, it's going to need to take a step back and wait and see if those juiced Iron Patriot decks can be taken down a tab a bit. I think that this deck, it was very good for me at the beginning of the season. It's gotten a little less good, but still good since then. But the more those Iron Patriot decks really, if you'll pardon the pun, iron themselves out and start getting really consistent at power output, the harder it's going to be to reliably beat them. So you have to do like some unreliable beating of them. And that means that Killmonger is invaluable. It means that Lady Deathstrike is invaluable. I am actually shocked at how good these cards have been. Like, I've been playing them for like a month now, and each time it's just been like, nope, this is great, this is great, this is great, this is great, this is amazing, it's the greatest thing of all time. And it just consistently has been. Like, this is... I keep wondering when I'm going to want Shang back in here, and I just never do. And every time I think I'm going to finally cut Killmonger, I run into a guy who's playing Clog or all of their demons out or something, and Killmonger is the only card in the entire game that would ever beat that. Arishem is pretty straightforward, honestly. Like, it's just doing numbers. That's really it. And so it needs things to keep its opponent's numbers down in ways that its opponents are not really going to be able to play around. Used to be that was Shadow King and Shang-Chi, but right now, I think the way the metagame is, it's Killmonger and it's Lady Deathstrike. I think Discard might just be perennially underrated. Like, maybe people will never give this deck the respect it deserves, but it can do points with the best of them, and that is really all there is to it. Where so many other decks are these inbred Luke Cagey type things, this deck has a similar point output, but is going to not be vulnerable to the same things. The big weaknesses the deck has are potentially a proliferation of Mobius and Mobius, making your swarms a lot more awkward with your Dracula, and of course a big issue with the card Red Guardian. Those are notable, but this deck, I mean, it's not like any other deck is perfect, you know? Like, every deck has stuff that is going to be pretty good into it, and I think maybe people overestimate how good those tech cards are into this deck, or maybe underestimate just how high the numbers can go when you play this deck the right way. It's a very strong deck with genuinely massive power output. I've played some Iron Patriot decks, and I've just been like, oh, they just have more numbers than me. There's nothing I can do about that. And since a lot of Iron Patriot decks don't have Red Guardian, yeah, there's actually just nothing you can do about it a lot of the time. You're just going to get Dracula and cry. We've talked a lot about the power of going over the top. Mr. Negative is a deck that will go exactly over the top of basically everything in the game about 40% of the time. So it won't happen all the time, but you are going to beat the crap out of people when you do. One of the things that I've noticed is that Mobius M. Mobius is not as effective against Iron Patriot as you would want it to be. That's not to say it's bad, but when I've played Mobius, it has not felt like the world beater that I would expect it to be. So even if the metagame moves to more Mobius, I think other people will run into that, and they'll be like, oh man, this isn't all that good. Which is great news for Mr. Negative, which absolutely folds to a Mobius M. Mobius. As long as people aren't playing that card, this deck is going to be your solution for, I just don't want to play the game anymore. I want to go over the top, I want to snap, and when I don't do my stuff, I want to retreat. I'm just trying to juice people for cubes. I want to have the strongest possible endgame. You will. This deck has the strongest possible endgame. Gorr is so completely insane. Normally, when he costs 0, it's not even a conversation worth having. You are going to win 85% of the games you get Mr. Negative out there on turn 3 or turn 4. If you're able to get Mr. Negative Jane, or even play Mr. Negative on 3 just without Jane, you're probably going to win. The deck is that strong right now because of all the sort of mid-range inbreeding that's happening. Numbers, huge, enormous, big as hell. Not unbeatable, but this is as good of a metagame for Mr. Negative as far as I can tell, with it still being bad, that we've ever had. And I guess I should probably elaborate on that. Like, when you do the Mr. Negative thing, it's better than ever. When you don't do the Mr. Negative thing, it's worse than ever, because you're the worst deck on Earth at contesting an Iron Patriot lane. So you're even more starkly differentiated between games where you did the thing and games where you did not do the thing. All right, y'all, I am going to stop the tier list there today. I'm going to keep it a little bit shorter. Let me know in the comments what you think about this more sort of condensed version of the tier list, or if you really want me to go through those last few decks that I normally put on here that are just a little bit more of a stretch, in my opinion. Let me know what you think. I'm really interested to hear your feedback. As always, I've been KM Best. You've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.